when I finished my Zen training and became a teacher, I had learned so much along the years, and it was combined with this military experience. So I initially wanted to call it the importance of Zen and the importance of, what did I call it? I wanted to talk about those various things. The importance of mysticism, science, air combat, and daily life. Yeah. I tried to see how all that actually can be worked together and appreciated from a different standpoint. I even talk about, because a lot of Buddhists' feeling is that, well, violence is a really bad thing. And, well, what is compassion in the realm of violence then? I wrote a chapter on what compassion is in the realm of violence. And so I looked at things that a lot of people haven't looked at in the Zen tradition or in the military tradition. So I thought I'm the one guy to write this, so I wrote it.
Well, I had a question on that. That's really interesting you say that, because I wrestle with this, and something I even chat with about my wife is because it's, again, Zen doesn't touch on that. There's some samurai stuff that kind of touch on it. But if you're incapable of violence, then you're harmless. And if then you're nothing, you're like worthless. And I guess, and so my thought is like, so you have to be capable of violence to protect the things that you love. Because, right, because again, as like, I wrestle with that in my mind as well. And I think you touched on that. So I'd love to get your perspective on that, because it's like, hey, for the person to be the monk, this peaceful, loving person, to hold the space there, I feel like there has to be like the Viking or whatever defending them, like, and protecting them. What's your?
I'm sure we'd agree. I like I said, I wrote a whole chapter on it in the book. Maybe you could read it sometime. But
Okay.
In Zen, we actually look at the precepts are like commandments. Okay, in Christianity, we have precepts too.
Yep.
Similar, but we look at them in Zen practice, at least in my school, from three different angles. There's you've ever heard Hinayana Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism?
Yes, but I'd love for you
Those
to
are the
elaborate.
two main sects of Buddhism. Hinayana prevalent more in Southeast Asia, and the Hinayana more in Korea and Japan and northern China. So the Hinayana is very strict approach to, if it says don't kill, don't kill. End of story. All right. That's a very conservative basic, we call that the Hinayana approach. And there's the Mahayana approach, which is a little more person, place, and amount idea. For example, let's say you're exceeding the speed limit, taking your wife to the hospital to give birth to your child. You're stopped by a cop, and the cop says, well, I got to write you a ticket here, mister. But you said, I'm trying to get to the hospital. My wife's about to give birth. And he goes, oh, shoot, let me lead you, So now you're both breaking the speed limit. You're both breaking the law. So what? It's for a good cause. So it's not a strict look at the letter of the precept. We got to know right time, right person, right place, right amount. Then the third way of looking at the precepts is the Buddhayana, which is in the sense of killing. Ultimately, there's no one to kill and no one who's doing the killing. That's an appreciation that comes from true realization. And so we look at those three angles and try to appreciate them all. And I talk about that in that chapter, and use the example of my friend from Miramar, Tom McGinnis. He was the first officer on American Flight 11, which was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center on 9/11. A good friend of mine. So what would he have done if he had a chance to defend himself and not turn the plane over to terrorists? Okay, let's say he killed a couple terrorists. Well, you just saved, how many thousands of lives did you just save on the ground? Are you going to call that an immoral act on his part, or somehow transgressing against a precept or commandment that can't be questioned? I say bullshit. So that's my argument to people who would claim, well, if you're a Buddhist, you can't do certain things. I say, well, if you're a dumb Buddhist, I guess you can't. But
yeah. That was well said, because I feel like that's the same thing as like we're to have a balance. Like there's, when I always think when people say like a maxim, like, hey, this is how it is. And I'm like, I don't know. It's like there may be a balance to that. There may be other options. And I think that like those three are really, or if you have those three paths almost, then you offer yourself more options, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So that's a real valuable practice in our school of looking at the commandments, the precepts from those angles. Very flexible.
Yeah.
You ever watch samurai movies?
I mean, I do you have a good
I
recommendation?
made
Oh,
some
sorry. Go
money
ahead.
in Japan by acting in Japanese movies and TV, and I got to meet my hero. Toshiro Mifune was one of the great samurai actors in Japan, and I got to meet him and do something with him in my first TV thing. So anyway,
Okay.
I just had some fun stuff. But I'm a big surfer. Keep surfing; it's really good for you.
Yes, sir.
I'm a skydiver. I skydive now because I can't surf anymore. My hips gone. I'm trying to have a little
Excellent.
fun before I check out.
Oh, you know what? I had another question for you, kind of more of a thought.
Miyamoto Musashi.
Yes, the Book of Five Rings.
Yeah, the Book of
And
Five Rings.
I've thought that that is, if we're talking about violence, that how do you, how do you balance the two? And I've thought that that book and his story is like, well, I guess that's how you do it. If you are going down the path of violence, right? I'm gonna be a swordsman, and just a roaming swordsman in Japan, and or that's doesn't happen now, but like that's how my thought of like that's how you do it of like, and that's how you win 100+ duels in a row. So I'd love to get your thought or
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Miyamoto Musashi in my youth, and I've read it. I don't remember that much about it, but I'll tell you a great samurai story. This was
yeah,
after there was a famous samurai who became a Zen master, Yamoka Teshu. I think I read about him too. Yamoka Teshu was a 6 foot two, 210 pound Japanese samurai. He was lived in the 19th century, toward the end of the Meiji. Was it the Meiji era? Toward the end of the shogun, the Tokugawa shogunate. So he was one of the
yep,
last of the samurai, and a very dedicated Zen student as well. And there was another famous samurai at the time, and they both had their own samurai schools. And their students wanted them to meet and have a duel, you know, a wood sword, but not, they, come on,
yep,
you guys should fight because you're the most renowned swordsman. So they eventually did. And the story is that they both, sat there facing each other in the in the combat hall there, Kendo hall, and they just stood there for like 45 minutes, just staring at each other. And then they both slowly backed away and left. And the
yeah,
reason was that there was no opening. The guy was so present, aware, and focused on his opponent that there was no opening. And I remember I used to use that idea in dogfighting because I would fly my jet at its maximum performance and just watch the other guy. And usually they would try to do something that left an opening for me. They would make a mistake. I wouldn't do anything right. I wait for them to make a mistake, and they always did because they got too aggressive or they lost sight or something. And to me, was a real key. Just being fully, knowing how to fly your plane, but being fully present and aware of the other guy. And he would
yep,
usually slip up, and you enter that opening that he gave you. But those two masters, there was no opening there because they really
yep.
were master swordsmen. I thought it was a good story.
I mean, well said, because I feel like that's another one where it's like the two best sword makers. They're like, hey, those two guys come together. Like, who has a sharper blade? And so they put the blades in the water in one sword maker, and then they put a piece of silk in the water and they let it flow down, and the silk comes across the first blade, and it just parts the silk. Then the other blade goes in the water, and then that silk comes by the blade and just goes directly around the blade. Which one is the better sword maker? You're like, oh,
Probably the one that goes
you
around
know,
the blade, right?
right. I agreed, and I think that's the super positioning where of quantum physics meet Zen Buddhism, and something like that. And I feel like that's Alan Watts probably keyed me in onto that a little bit, where I'm
The
like, oh,
first half
how
of
the
my
hell?
book, the first
Yes.
whole half of this book is on science and quantum mechanics.
So I would have gotten your book, but it wouldn't have gotten out here still. And I don't, you don't have the Kindle version. Otherwise,
That's okay. Nobody else reads it either, so it's okay.
well, I would have gotten it. So, but it would have taken, I think, about 2 weeks to get over to, or more, to get over here to Bali. But Barry, thank you so much for your time. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure speaking with you.
it
If
has
you
been.
could
It's been
just
fun.
maybe give everybody a plug of your book. Maybe I don't know if you have a website so they can
Yeah,
find
you can
you.
find it on Amazon.
All right, top